Dragon Ball Z Sparking Zero is one of the most anticipated games of 2024, and just recently the developers over at Spike Chunsoft revealed a lot of new gameplay, including support for split-screen multiplayer, but this local split-screen functionality only works in the game's Room of Spirit and Time stage, which is essentially barren minus the entrance area. The developers mentioned that local split screen was not originally considered as a feature when development started, with them only adding it after fan outcry. Instead, the focus was going to be on the game's online functionality, and the fan outcry wasn't unwarranted. This was a feature in all three of the original Sparking Tenkaichi games, as well as the Raging Blast games, which can be thought of as a spiritual successor. And these games do not feature the same major restrictions on stage selection. So to the fan that's not aware of the challenges involved with implementing split screen, especially with the increasing strength of consoles, this might seem like the studio just being cheap or lazy. So what makes split screen so hard? Well, believe it or not, split screen is not as simple from a technical level and is something you often want to be thinking about from a design perspective from the beginning. But before we can get into that, we need to think from a non-technical level, as this plays a big part in that initial specific design. Split screen multiplayer and just local multiplayer has dwindled since the launch of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, as players adopted online networking through services such as Xbox Live and PlayStation Network at an increasing rate. Dragon Ball Xenoverse released cross-generation on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 in 2015 and would receive local multiplayer functionality, but with no split screen and limited stages. Online functionality would be the primary method of player versus player, and I think the success of Xenoverse and Xenoverse 2 played a big part in that initial decision. But it's worth mentioning that Xenoverse 1 and 2 are not functionally the same as the Sparking games, with the Xenoverse series placing a lot more emphasis on open stages where multiple characters could fight at the same time. The Sparking series, on the other hand, is explicitly a one-on-one fighter, albeit with the ability to swap fighters out during the fight. So what would be the technical cost of implementing split-screen multiplayer? Well, from a basic level, split screen works by taking two virtual cameras and rendering their unique views to your monitor or TV screen. And that means whatever rendering time you have working on one screen is now essentially doubled. However, there are a number of different steps that go into the rendering process, including rasterization, lighting, culling, shader computation, and more. Post-processing effects such as motion blur, depth of field, and color correction, along with particle manipulation, also drastically influence rendering time and put stress on the GPU. Modern GPUs do an excellent job of powering through these steps and allow us to push major graphical feats. But as I said before, this is now happening twice with the inclusion of a second virtual camera. And given what we've seen of Sparking Zero so far, it seems to make heavy use of its particles and special effects. This rendering time can be mitigated in a few different ways for split screen. One such way is by lowering the resolution of each window, or lowering the quality of assets and effects per camera. Might sound obvious, but if there's less to render, you tend to render faster. But players and reviewers are not always so kind to drops in quality or things that make the game look worse, even if it's serving a purpose. Another is just accepting the hit on frame rate. Sometimes players are willing to accept a drop in frame rate from 60 to 30 frames per second if it means they can play with their friends on the couch. The problem, however, is sometimes certain logic is locked to a specific frame rate, meaning developers have to make sure that frame rate doesn't drop beyond a certain limit. You often see things such as enemy attack logic and physics affected by frame rate when it isn't locked or accounted for carefully. Developers also have to factor in the process of streaming in assets. Oftentimes, pieces of level are loaded in at runtime in order to give the impression of a seamless experience. Accelerated loading through the PlayStation 5 solid state drive was a major selling point for the console, but the way you load in your assets or handle level of detail is usually dependent on your character's own position and viewpoint. Online multiplayer in this case means that only one player is loading in assets for their specific screen, and their own console is doing that work, rather than with local split screen having to account for two separate views on one machine. This isn't really a problem for certain games like Rocket League, where the player is usually locked to a relatively small arena, so you don't have a lot of assets to continually load in or update. But Sparking Zero gives players a lot of room to move around in. And fighters can also seemingly traverse large distances in a minimal amount of time, matching the speed of the series. The Room of Spirit and Time alleviates that by essentially being a void, where nothing in the environment seemingly needs to get loaded in, thus helping mitigate the impact on performance and ensuring an overall smoother experience. With all this being said, split screen has always technically been possible within the game, as the developers have shown with this Room of Spirit and Time inclusion. The game is built off of Unreal Engine 5, and there are other games that utilize the engine with this specific feature in mind. However, accounting for it early is a major factor in getting that feature integrated smoothly, as the developers admitted this wasn't their primary focus. And so I'm grateful that they were able to get at least something in, and honestly I'll probably be using online multiplayer anyway. As a kid playing Budokai Tenkaichi 2, it would suck when my siblings couldn't play and I wanted to fight against some of my friends that were just not close enough to walk over to my house. And online multiplayer is a great feature, and it helps keep games like this alive for so many years. Anyway, thank you for listening to this video. If you want to hear more Dragon Ball or gaming related content, feel free to subscribe for more videos as they come out. Alright, bye.